Hello everyone, welcome to the Unique History channel. Today we'll be reading Ference Szalasi and the Arrowcross by Dr. Pablo de Vago. It was some years ago in the middle of June 1940 that I, as a representative of the Arrowcross in the Hungarian lower house, presented a draft for the integration and autonomy of national minorities under the Hungarian crown. The purpose of this law was that every citizen of the Hungarian state should, on reaching his adulthood, decide once and for all which of the 7 nationalities of Hungary he wished to belong. Each of these national minorities would then possess certain autonomous rights within the structure of the state and would present its demands through its own responsible leader elected by secret vote, who would swear an oath of loyalty to the state and to the Constitution. Essentially, this was a contribution to the general idea of the problem of nationality throughout Europe, although it was in this case advanced as a solution of the miniature problem of the many nationalities inhabiting the Danube basin, whose integration was obviously an intimate necessity. I was very much surprised to find that while my previous proposals had been dismissed to the waste paper basket without further ado. This proposal was made the subject of a violent attack upon our party, which ended with the motion to deprive us of all our right to sit in the chamber. Count 𝖳𝗒𝖾 Minister-President Count 𝖳તુ𝖾 expressed his regret that 2 Hungarian representatives could present such a measure which would damage their traditionally good relations with Germany and was extremely contrary to the historic will of the Hungarian state. The opposition rushed to his support, including those who were later to be the most eager supporters of Moscow. The President of the Chamber stated the House denounced the minority measure, which would not be brought forward for discussion. The next move was to mobilize the mob against us on the streets. We were attacked as traitors of Hungary, worthy of being hanged or certified as insane. At the same time, a violent press campaign against us raged throughout the country while our own party organ was muzzled. This went on for 2 weeks, until suddenly a pause ensued. The Red Army moves in. The Red Army had marched into Bessarabia, and Romania dissolved into chaos. All of a sudden, the government realized that the Transylvanian question had become an actuality, and that the expansion of Hungarian authority might as well depend on their handling of the minority question, on which the good 𝖳𝗒𝖾 had no knowledge of the German standpoint. The legal proceedings to exclude us from the House were hurriedly adjourned. While 𝖳તુЛ went to consult Hitler, it was only after he had convinced himself that the Third Reich had no interest in a minority question, and was, if anything, opposed to our proposals, and that he returned and the action against us was brought to a head. In my speech for the defense, I pointed out the failure to deal with the minority question which had led to the catastrophe of the Trianon, the Treaty of 1914-1918 war, which led to the dismembering of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the question of Transylvania now rested for the same reason in balance. A condemnation of the party for making these proposals could easily lead to a general condemnation of the governing class of Hungary, as desiring its former position as a domination of the Danube basin, with disastrous consequences. All of this fell on deaf ears when Count 𝖳તુЛ added the weight of his authority as minister-president to the prosecution. In conclusion, I gave my last warning when the minority problem was not only a Hungarian one, but concerned the whole of Europe, and that if we did not settle it now, it would be settled against our will and by the processes of history. We were asked to withdraw our proposals, and we refused to do so. We were asked to declare to have lost our right to sit in the House the majority of 11-1. German policy. The responsibility of this grave error in respect of the minority problem does not rest alone on Count 𝖳તુЛ. His attitude was very greatly affected by his reaction to the equally erroneous policy of the Third Reich, which had followed in respect the German minorities in foreign countries. Although the National Socialists had revolted again in the misuse of liberalism in the social sense, yet even this revolutionary movement could not entirely emancipate itself from the nationalism of the 18th century. through the creation of philosophy, which raised the egoism of their own nationalism to divine proportions. Fascists as well as National Socialists failed to carry their historic mission to bring about a union of the peoples in a co-national sense. Co-nationalism. Through the lack of such a concept, both the magnificent attempts of Napoleon and Hitler to bring a union of Europe by force proved fruitless, because victory of their weapons was not followed over by the souls of men, and this could only have been achieved by the voluntary subordination of nationalism of the victors to the common co-nationalism of all. And this victory over themselves they were incapable of achieving. Unfortunately, none of the nations at Geneva had proven capable of this moral ascendancy, of this ideal of universal justice raised above all national interest, nor could any of the latter victors rise to the same height. The logical consequence was that instead of bringing union of Europe, they led to its division. Furthermore, the National Socialist thesis of a blood relations between all Germans, having priority over local loyalties. The German minorities in other countries became explosive material within those local states. Bismarck on Hungary. It was this egocentric attitude which sterilized much sympathy for Germany, not only in Great Britain, but also on the continent. This was primarily the case in Hungary. The greatest diplomatic genius that Germany produced, Otto von Bismarck, once wrote these significant words: "If I should have the misfortune to become Emperor of Austria, then I would immediately move to Budapest, ride in the hussar uniform, speak Hungarian, and would combine with Hungary everything that belongs to it." On another occasion, the Iron Chancellor said, "Here on the Danube and in the Carpathians are the Hungarians. It is the same for us, they were all Germans, for their destiny is bound up with our own. They stand or they fall with us." Failure to realize this fact in the first and second decisions reached by the Third Reich at Vienna brought into the castry of both these peoples in the Danube basin. Szalasi, Prime Minister. All through the war years of 1941, 1942, and 1943, Szalasi and the arrowcross movement remained cold-shouldered by both the official Hungarian government and by the German authorities. Every endeavor was made during this period to undermine the movement and Szalasi's authority over it by the offer of ministerial posts to his subordinates, all of which were rejected by them, and also efforts were made to create a rival organization under other leaders. All these failed to break the movement, which continued to enjoy considerable support among the people. Meanwhile, under German pressure, the government undertook severe measures against the Jews, many of whose shops and businesses were closed and their owners interned. This had the effect of bringing economic life to the country almost to a standstill, as trained personnel to take their place was not available owing to the failure of the government to follow the proposals of the arrowcross movement that the cooperative training of the professional occupation class should be introduced. The Red Army advance. It was 1944 that the inevitable crisis came, when the Red Army pressed forward into Romania and approached the Carpathians, owing to the treacherous capitulation of Michael of Romania, who only stayed his throne for a few years in consequence. The whole country fell under Russian occupation. The fatal result of the partition of Transylvania then became obvious as Red Army units penetrated the undefended passes of southern Carpathians into the Bennett, completely turning the mountain defense line further north. The Hungarian army had no alternative but to retreat across the Danube plain towards the capital, Budapest. It was at this moment when the Regent Horthy gave his radio instructions to the Hungarian forces to lay down their arms, and that the Germans turned to Szalasi and the arrowcross movement as the Red Army approached before the capital city itself. Even at this moment, Szalasi did not declare dictatorship, although the desperate situation might as well justified him in doing so. Parliament declared the surrender broadcast by the regent unconstitutional, and the very political opponents who had dishonored, persecuted, and declared Szalasi Szalasi to be a lunatic now, combined to give him a free hand. As both houses of parliament entrusted him as authority as premier, he formed a coalition and conducted the affairs of the state in accordance with his oath to the constitution. Broadcast appeal. Though the tragic errors of the past defense of the Danubian plain had now become the impossibility, and yet Szalasi did not shrink the duty of the attempting to the last moment to make good the fatal mistakes of his political opponents. I myself made a broadcast appealing for volunteers for the defense of the capital, and 15,000 men came forward, mostly devoted members of our organization. For 2 months they fought with the utmost heroism, side by side with their German comrades in defense of the city, until our beautiful Budapest lay in ruins about us. One of the loveliest cities in Europe was sacrificed to keep the Red Hordes at bay in defense of our continent. Fighting still, and the remainder of our forces retreated into Austria and finally capitulated to the Americans when our beloved leader Szalasi was handed over to his most bitter enemies and for an inevitable trial and execution. Without crucifixion, no resurrection. The arrowcross never stood on the sunny side of political life. Szalasi and his devotee adherents had never enjoyed the privileges and power of German favor until it was all lost. Their path from beginning had been one of loss of livelihood and deprival of freedom, which passed through internment camps, prisons, and the end on the gallows. It was a political road to Calvary in the fulfillment of the historic destiny of Hungary, which our movement had foreseen the eventual means of salvation. The slogan of our movement, coined by Szalasi himself, "Without crucifixion, no resurrection," proved to be prophetic realization on the tragedy of the whole of Hungary. Only those who have the courage to sacrifice their lives for the highest values of its life itself earn the right, paradoxical as may seem, to live as free men. Hitler's regime fell because of its narrow world philosophy. This was the expression of an insufficiently generous ethical foundation upon which to erect a monumental edifice to united continent. National Socialism is not an article for export of political wholesalers, said Hitler when he was at his height of his political leader. National Socialism is the character and blood association of the German people. Only Germans have the right to regard themselves as National Socialists. With these proud words, the leader of the German minority in Hungary refused the offered hand of the arrowcross movement, despite the fact that 30 years before Germans and Hungarians had fought on side by side on the Carpathians against the onslaught of Russia, which they so courageously repelled. According to this National Socialist thesis, what had preserved the welfare of the German people could not serve the interests of other people. The government in the Third Reich was within its own frontiers socialistic and anti-Semitic, but outside its own frontiers it fully supported feudal and pro-Jewish regime of 𝖳𝗒𝖾, because it saw the tyranny of this clique a welcome instrument for the destruction and the rival expression of the will to life of the Hungarian people. This clique was actually beneficial of German victories and political support. When 𝖳𝗒𝖾 entered Kaza and Kolozsvár on the white horse, wearing the uniform of the Admiral Austrian-Hungarian Navy, he was enjoying support from Berlin, a world of political philosophy he had persecuted in his own country. The representatives of the German minority in Parliament were actually instructed from Berlin to give their support to the government party against us. When I stood for election myself at Serpent, my German supporters abandoned me only 24 hours before the election on secret instructions they had been received from Berlin. So Berlin supported in Hungary, in a land for geographical and natural resources, was allied to Germany, a regime which, according to the very world philosophy of National Socialism, was composed of traitors to their own people. But he who favors traitors breeds treachery. Through the lack of ethical and logical basis in the policy of the Third Reich towards Hungary, the door was opened for the drive of Stalin into the Danube basin and on to the Vienna. But have the Western powers learned anything from the fall of Hitler? The injustice of Nuremberg was the deepest sense of a capitulation by the West to the ideology of Moscow. For here were punished and persecuted the heroism of soldiers and the loyalty of many officials, with, in short, the very virtues of which for all time had been honored as a basis upon which the existence of states must depend. Through this injustice the West has shown its germs of its own destruction through acts of its own sovereign powers. It has now become a principle of international law: the higher an officer rises in the loyal discharge of his duty to his country, the closer he approaches the steps of the gallows. Such executions merely have the effect that we shall soon place the gallows beside the cross, symbol of our deepest veneration. Even now, after a Cold War of many years' duration, which is rapidly coming to a boil, a regulation could appear in the United States by no former member of the Hungarian army, especially those who had belonged to the officer ranks, should be allowed to emigrate to the United States, on the strained grounds that they had prolonged the war by their resistance to the advance of the Red Army. It seems to me the lack of ethical and logical sense, of which I have accused the Third Reich, applies far more with the emphasis to America, which has learned nothing from the errors of the past.